Hey everybody, today we are beginning our investigation in some basic economic concepts. Today we'll start by looking at supply and demand and how they interact to create what we call the price system. More specifically, we'll look at the demand curve and what it represents. We'll look at the supply curve and what it represents, and we'll talk about this concept of equilibrium, which is the general tendency of the market and what does it show us. And we'll look also at what happens when prices are not at this concept of equilibrium. So first we look at demand, and when we graph demand, it's a graph with a vertical axis measuring price and the horizontal axis measuring quantity. And the demand curve itself is a combination of all possible combinations of price and quantity that exist. That is, if a price is $10, how many units of whatever good we're talking about do people want to buy? And the overall market demand is just the sum of all of the individual people's demands for a good. So if there are 10 people in the room and the price is $10, maybe only one person wants whatever the good is that we're selling. So the quantity demanded would be 1. But if the price were $1, maybe all 10 of us would want it. And so there would be a quantity demanded of 10. And there's a combination of price and quantity in between those two extremes. And so when we plot it, you'll notice something very specific about the demand curve and its shape. And that is that as the price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. The amount that people want in the overall market is less as the price rises. So we have a downward sloping demand curve. Showing us that as prices rise, people want less of something, and as prices fall, they want more of something. That relationship is known as the law of demand. And the law of demand states that as prices rise, the quantity demanded shrinks, which is why we have this downward sloping demand curve. And this is true for virtually every product in the world. The more expensive it is, the less we want. The cheaper it is, the more we want. Now, within demand, we can talk about something known as elasticity. How much more do I want if the price rises? Or how much less do I want, I should say, as the price rises? Or how much more would I want when the price falls? And so we can talk about demand being either inelastic or elastic. So we think about something like a silicone band. Does it stretch? We put a lot of effort into stretching it. We pull on it really hard, but it doesn't change its shape very much. So we'd say those live-strong silicone bands tend to be inelastic, whereas a rubber band doesn't take a lot of energy at all for us to stretch it very widely, right? So when it takes very little effort to cause a big change, then we say it's elastic in nature. And the same is true for the demand curve. In a case where the demand curve is generally vertical in nature, we'd say that demand is relatively inelastic, because if I go from an initial price and I drop the price by a lot, you can see it's a huge drop in price. There's a very little increase in quantity demanded. Certainly as a percent change, the price is dropping by a large percentage. The quantity demanded is increasing only a little bit. That tells me demand is inelastic in nature. It means that basically I'm buying all of the product that I need, and it doesn't matter what the price is, I'm going to buy it anyway. The opposite of that is elastic demand. In this case, it's basically a horizontal line. When it's elastic, it means a little tiny change in price leads to a very large change in quantity demanded, certainly in percentage terms. So we can look and say, well, if we start at price 1, I want a certain amount of this good. And if I drop the price just a little tiny bit, there's a huge increase in absolute terms and in relative terms, percentage increase-wise, huge increase in the quantity demanded. So in this case, what we're saying is basically, I'm willing to pay a certain price for this good, and if you charge me a little bit more, I won't buy very much of it at all. And if you charge me a little bit less, I'll want a lot of it. So when we talk about demand being elastic or inelastic, that's what we're trying to think about is, what are goods where if you raise the price, I'll stop buying it, or compared, which would be elastic, versus goods where if you raise the price a little bit, I'm still going to buy pretty much the same amount I did before. So take a minute to look at these options and press pause, think about what you think the answers are, and then press play to see if you're right. We've got 6 goods here. Some of them are elastic in demand and some are inelastic. EpiPens, epinephrine, Is that elastic or inelastic demand? Coke versus Pepsi. If I raise the price of Coke, what does that do to your willingness to pay for Coke relative to buying Pepsi? Pencils. Run-of-the-mill, standard number 2 pencils. Gasoline. Clothing, so think about all the different manufacturers of clothing. And then breakfast cereal with all the various different kinds and flavors. So think about which one of those is inelastic, which of those are inelastic. Press pause. Go through it. When you've got an answer, press play. See how you did. If you said that EpiPens were inelastic, you would be correct. People need EpiPens to survive. If you have an allergic reaction to bee stings or nuts, you'll go into anaphylaxis and you could die from it. So you need an EpiPen, and it doesn't matter whether EpiPen is $1 or $1,000. If the issue is that you're going to die without it, you're going to spend whatever it takes to buy it. That's the very definition of something being inelastic. Pepsi versus Coke, they're generally elastic, because if you raise the price of Pepsi, then people give up on Pepsi and switch over to Coke, because while they're not exactly the same, they're close enough that I'm not really willing to pay an increase in price for one when I can get the other one for relatively less. Pencils, again, pretty elastic. That is, if you raise the price of one brand of pencils, I'll just switch to the other. You raise the price of a regular pencil by 5%, then to heck with that brand, I'll just buy another one, because at the end of the day, it's a piece of wood with some graphite in the middle of it. So, you know, your purchase decision changes drastically with a change in price. That's elastic in nature. Gasoline tends to be inelastic. I've got to get to work. I've got to get from place to place. I've got to pay for gas to make my car operate. So whatever the price of gas is, I'm still driving the same amount. I might reduce my driving a little bit, but generally speaking, not really. Because my purchase decision is not moved by the price of the good, it's inelastic in nature. Clothes and breakfast cereals are very similar in the same way that if you raise the price of one shirt, then I'll just buy shirts from someone else. If you raise the price of Frosted Flakes, then I'll get a different type of sugary cereal. So I'm very responsive to a change in price. The quantity of each of these goods that I want to purchase changes a lot when there's a little bit of a change in price. And so those are elastic in nature. There is a supply curve. It's very much like the demand curve. It also has the same graph, or it's the same axes, price in the vertical, quantity in the horizontal. And it is also showing us all of the combinations of price and quantity that can exist under a certain set of circumstances. And this is from a supply point of view. So if the price is low, then suppliers don't feel like making this particular product. They'd rather make something else. And so the quantity supplied is small. And as the price of the good rises, as people are willing to pay more for it, then people are more willing to produce additional quantities of the good. And so you'll notice that as the price increases, we see an increase in the quantity supplied, which is essentially what's known as the law of supply. And it's basically that the rise in price leads to an increase in quantity supplied, and that leads to an upward sloping supply curve. Equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. That's the point where the amount people want is equal to the amount people are willing to make, and that price is what we call the market price. That's where the quantity demanded and quantity supplied are the same. And the market tends to want to head towards equilibrium. And it doesn't require someone to tell it what to do. It doesn't need a government planner or someone in charge of the market to dictate what the price is. People and businesses working together, pursuing their own self-interest, will eventually land at this market price, this equilibrium price. Now, why is that the case? Well, let's take a look. If the price were to be above equilibrium, then ask yourself this as you're looking at it. Which quantity is greater? The quantity demanded or the quantity supplied? And if we look at the graph at the price of P1, we come horizontally across. We see it crosses the demand curve at a quantity, and it hits the supply curve at a greater quantity. There is more supplied than there is demanded. When that happens, we say that there is a surplus. So when price is above equilibrium, there is a surplus of goods. So then the question is, what do you think happens to the price of the good when there's a surplus? So take a second, pause the video, come up with an answer for yourself, then press play and see if you're right. If there's a surplus of goods, that means there's more available than people are willing to buy. And suppliers don't like to make things and not sell them. So they got to figure out a way to get rid of all this extra that's laying around. Well, you know from consumer experience that when stores have lots of extra things laying around they want to get rid of, they usually put it on sale. And that's what's going to happen here. Producers are going to reduce the price of the good so that they can get rid of it. And as they lower the price, they incentivize people to increase the quantity demanded, increase their willingness to pay for the good, until eventually we end up at equilibrium where there's none left over. If the price were below equilibrium, then we'd have what's known as a shortage, because here the quantity demanded is going to be greater than the quantity supplied. At this point, there are more wanted than there is available. So what do you think happens to the price? Well, the price in this case should go up. And the reason it should go up is because people are going to bid against each other to try and get this limited resource, this thing that is scarce and not available to everybody. So those who are willing to pay more will offer to pay more. And as the price rises, some people are not willing to pay that higher price. And so they stop trying to get the good. And we begin to see that as the price rises, fewer and fewer people are interested in purchasing it. More and more are being made available, until we end up at equilibrium where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And the market does this all on its own. It does not need anyone to direct us to get to equilibrium. In fact, that's the whole beauty of the price system, is that markets adjust based on signals. Whenever there's an imbalance, signals are sent either to consumers or to suppliers to change their willingness to pay or the price they're willing to sell the product at, until those imbalances are eliminated. And so this is what Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand, that markets don't need a director to tell them what to do. Individuals pursuing their own self-interest will lead the market to an equilibrium outcome. So there's a short video on the invisible hand and on Adam Smith that I'll go ahead and link in the description that you should go and watch as well. One final comment on the price of the function of the price system, and that is this, that equilibrium price is never too high. That the market price is what the market is willing to bear. And so anytime you see someone that says a price is too high, what they mean is not that the market is producing a price that is unreasonable, but that the price that the market is charging is too high for them. Because it is counterproductive for markets to charge a price above equilibrium. If they do that, if businesses do that, they'll create a surplus. People aren't willing to pay it, and they've made something for no good reason. And they won't set it unnecessarily below equilibrium because they're missing out on sales. Equilibrium price is what it ought to be. The only reason people consider it to be too high is because they are not willing to pay it themselves. And this is a far better outcome than to have somebody dictating or directing the economic system, because what we find is that people do not have enough information or knowledge to be able to do this on their own. The markets are too dynamic and it requires too much information about people's interests and preferences and tastes to make a decision where you can set the price effectively for all of the thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of products that are out there. So the price system is a pretty amazing thing. It does a great job allocating scarce resources. It relies on supply and demand. And we'll talk more in class. If you have questions, come see me.